Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our Shepherd Digital Ministries. I'm Pastor John Carolus, and today we're going to be concluding this series where we've been exploring the person of middle-aged David. We've covered a lot of ground. I don't want to miss that. We have talked about some challenging topics. We've talked about adultery. We've talked about conspiracy for murder. We've talked about assault. We've talked about violation. We've talked about betrayal. We've talked about straight-up murder. We've talked about banishment, exile, reconciliation. We have covered a lot of ground, and there is still more to come. Today's narrative is equally challenging for us. You see, Absalom, when he was brought back to Jerusalem, didn't talk to his father for 2 years straight. His father wouldn't see him. And so Absalom wanted to get David's general, Joab, the one that got Absalom back in Jerusalem in the first place, to give him an audience for the king, with the king, to try and reunite him to his father. And Joab wouldn't do it until Absalom acted out, burned down one of Joab's fields. Joab finally said, hey, David, why don't you get back together with his son? They reconcile. But at that point, the damage was done. Absalom decides that he's going to make his move. He amasses for himself a following. He sits in the gate. He wins people's hearts over through his judgments, through his influence. He hires charioteers to ride around with him and begins to build this following that eventually he convinces to declare him king over the nation rather than his father, who is still alive and well in the throne room in Jerusalem. So Absalom takes this group of people down to Hebron. If you remember, that's the place where David first was ruling early on in his reign. And there Absalom declares himself king of Israel and Judah. As word of that reaches the palace, David and his entourage, they escape across the Jordan River. They get out of town. Now, some of David's loyal followers actually turn their backs on him and go and follow Absalom. David has a few loyal people who go with him. And eventually there is all-out war in a forest outside of Jerusalem. And there Joab, David's trusted general, once again proves himself faithful. There are thousands of deaths in that battle, a lot of them accounted for by actually the dangers of the forest rather than the fighting itself. And Absalom gets caught up in a tree. He is vanquished by some of Joab's men. And the good news is given to David, who mourns the death of his son. And he is broken apart and he is grieving. And rather than just rejoicing that his threat has been mitigated, he's missing his son. And so he's grieving and he is just a pile of sorrow. And so Joab actually goes and speaks firmly with David. He gives him these specific words. He says in 2 Samuel 19, "You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You've made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you would be pleased. Now go out there and congratulate your troops. For I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you will be worse off than ever before." So the king went out and took his seat at the town gate, and as the news spread throughout the town that he was there, everyone went to him. And so there we have this picture of how Joab has convinced the king to recognize the great loyalty, the great price that his men have paid in remaining faithful to him and in protecting his legacy and in allowing him to remain on the throne as God had prophesied and promised his son David. Then we get these two episodes of David's interaction with people who had turned their back on him previously. One of them had been mocking David as he left town, saying, "You deserve this. This is coming your way for a long time." Another one is one of Saul's descendants who, you remember, David took the throne from Saul, so there was always a lot of drama between them. And then another was one who was faithful to David while he was there in Jerusalem, but then didn't go with him out of the city, and he was hoping to remain protected by Absalom, but David comes back in victory. And so there's a little bit of awkwardness here. David has an opportunity to exact revenge, to make them pay the price for the betrayal. And instead we get this. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shimei should die, for he cursed the Lord's anointed king." But David responds, "Who asked your opinion, you sons of Zeruiah?" David exclaimed, "Why have you become my adversary today? This is not the day for execution, for today I am once again the king of Israel." Then turning to Shimei, David vowed, "Your life will be spared." And then we got a lot of weird names today, a lot of hard to pronounce names, but David speaks about Mephibosheth, one of Saul's descendants, and he says, "You are spared, you are given some of the land that I had promised to your father's descendants, to your grandfather's descendants." Another person, Barzillai, is blessed to have a son cared for by the king's court and by the king's servants. What we see here is that God preserved his servant David. He saved David from even the betrayal of his own son. Now, David grieved the loss of his son. He didn't want to have to grieve another one of his children. But God protected David, restored him to the throne in Jerusalem, and then in response to this, David, instead of taking out his revenge and vengeance upon those who had wronged him, he has mercy. So we see two things I want to draw to your attention here in this text. One, David's faithful general Joab helps him see the irony and actually the hurt that David is giving to his fighters, to his soldiers, to his generals by wishing that Absalom had died and Absalom had lived and David had died instead. Because it makes the soldiers wonder, what are we fighting for if the king would rather have died than his son? David goes out there and he encourages them with his presence. He judges them rightly. And there we have David recognizing the significance that it is to continue in the vocation that God had called him to in ruling in righteousness the nation God had put under his feet. We also see David acting in mercy and kindness as opposed to revenge and anger toward those who had wronged him. David had all the power once again. The pieces were in his hand. He had all the cards. There was nothing that his adversaries could do against him. And David decided to respond to these individuals in mercy and kindness. So this is where I want you to think about God's interactions in your life. What we know over the course of the last weeks is that none of our decisions are out of God's control to turn to good, in the past, in the present, or in the future. We also know that God is committed to pursuing us no matter how far away from him we get, no matter how exhausted we are, no matter how defeated we become, no matter how much it feels like we've been poured out onto dry ground like a glass of water. God pursues us. And actually the blood of Jesus pays for us to come back into reconciled relationship with him. And now the question is, what do we do with that victory? What do we do with that restoration? God encourages us to live in mercy and in kindness, not grieving the past to the point where those who he has presently brought us into relationship with wonder what it is that God has done, but instead through our mercy and kindness, they experience the love of God through the actions and the words that we put out into the world. So think about that question this week. Do you have an opportunity to show mercy? Are you given opportunities to display kindness in the words you say, in the actions that you take? Is there something God is providing for you to be able to do that through which he might reveal himself to others? God preserved his servant David. He was faithful even through David's wickedness, even through David's lostness, even through the threats on David's life. And through it all, God used David to display his kindness and mercy to those who had betrayed the king. You and I have that same opportunity through the grace of Christ to be a conduit through which God works grace and peace in the world. Do that work this week, not in fear of being punished for not being perfect enough, but rather in joy and in expectation for that opportunity to continue to be offered. And then you just might be surprised the work that God does through those merciful and kind acts. Thanks for joining us through this reflection on middle-aged David. And I hope that you join us next week for an exploration of the Lord's Prayer and into the season of Lent as we look for the ways in which the gospel writers fit Jesus' words from the cross into their bigger picture. And we'll see just what that message is when we understand Christ for us in that life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.